anyway, so it looks like Abel's doing a good job. That's the implication. The story doesn't say Abel is doing a really good job with his sacrifices. It just hints at it. And I like that because it leaves that ambiguity. It's like maybe you're working really hard and your brother's working really hard, and you really can't tell the difference between your quality of work and his quality of work. But for some reason he's succeeding like mad. That happens, right? Because there's an arbitrary element to life. And so the story says, well, the Lord has respect unto Abel and his offering, and there's an implication that maybe the reason for that is that, you know, Cain's offerings are a little second rate, but the story doesn't come out and club you over the head with that idea. It just leaves it as an ambiguous possibility, and the reason for that is sometimes you make sacrifices and maybe they're even real ones and they don't pay off, or they pay off for someone better. And so there is this arbitrary nature of the transcendent that you're attempting to deal with. It rewards and doesn't reward more or less of its own accord. There's an element of that. And so it's ambiguous in the text, even though there's a hint that, you know, perhaps Abel is doing a better job than Cain. So I like that. I think it's very sophisticated. So what happens? Well, Cain makes his offerings and God isn't happy with them. Now we don't know how Cain figures out that God isn't happy with his offerings. We get some hints of that too, but the story does tell us that's what happens. And so then we get the psychological response on the part of Cain. Now one response could be, Jesus, I must be doing something wrong. I better straighten myself out. You know, I better come up with a better quality offering and try that again. That isn't what happens. What happens instead is that Cain becomes angry, wroth, and his countenance falls. And so what does that mean? It means this, right? It means he is not happy. He's angry and out for revenge. And so I've been thinking about this a lot lately with regards to the literature on inequality, because there's a very good literature that shows, for example, that there's a measure called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is a numerical index of the relative inequality of a geographical locale. So for example, if you went to Newfoundland, where everyone is roughly not very rich, or North Dakota, say, almost everyone there is, say, lower middle class, something like that, or upper working class, something like that. Very little variability, low Gini coefficient, okay? And if you go to Miami Beach, say, where everyone's rich, low Gini coefficient, because it isn't an index of absolute wealth or absolute poverty, it's an index of relative poverty. And so if everyone's rich, the relative poverty is low, and if everyone's poor, the relative poverty is low. Now, one question is, where's the crime? And you might think, well, the crime is where the absolute poverty is high, right? Or the absolute wealth is low. That's where the crime is. Well, that's wrong. If things are relatively distributed in an egalitarian manner, the male-on-male crime, especially homicide, is low. And it's also the case where everyone is rich. But if you go into places where there's some rich people, but not very many, and there's a lot of people who are comparatively poor, then the male homicide rates and violent crime rates amp up substantially. And it's a consequence of male-on-male competition. And so what you could derive from that, and maybe even reasonably, is that you should flatten out the damn income distribution, because you're destabilizing the society by facilitating male criminal aggression. You can make a good case for that. You know, in places like Colombia, where the Gini coefficient got unbelievably extreme, society got so violent that it could barely hold itself together. So you can make a conservative argument for redistribution of income, using the observation that if the income distribution gets too extreme, the whole bloody thing starts to destabilize and might fall. But then you also might say, well, wait a minute, is it inequality that's driving the violence? Or is it resentment of the inequality that's driving the violence? Now that's a tough question, because you might say, well, what if the game is rigged and there's no way of moving up the power hierarchy? Well, then maybe anger and the desire for revolution is the appropriate response. But that doesn't really mean to me that the response should be the sort of thing that you see in high Gini coefficient neighborhoods, which is intraracial violence between men. So for example, in neighborhoods where there's high murder rates, the murders are always between young men, and they're always within race. And so that doesn't seem to me to be exactly a politically revolutionary move, right? It's more like violent competition for the sake of attaining status. And you might say, well, that's reasonable, but because the inequality is there and men need to find status because it's part of what drives them forward, it's part of what makes them attractive to women, it's a necessity. Well, the question is, do you attain status through destruction, or do you start making your offerings, putting your offerings in order? And that's something we really need to figure out, because that's a fundamental political question. It's a fundamental political question. Anyways, what